In this video, I'm going to briefly cover how the brain understands speech. I won't go into too much detail about how the ear works. There are other videos that cover that topic very well, but I think it's important to explain what sound is to begin with. Sound is fluctuations in air pressure, basically waves of high and low pressure. When you see a simple waveform like this is effectively just a measure of air pressure. When the line is high, the air pressure is high. When it's low, the air pressure is low. You can also think of this as the oscillation of one of the particles making up the air. As the line goes up and down, the particle oscillates back and forth in line with the air pressure. So you can see the air pressure fluctuates in a complicated, almost random way. And this line really does represent all the information that comes into one of your ears. Of course, you have two ears, so you're getting two slightly different patterns of air pressure fluctuation, as your ears are in slightly different places. But still, it really doesn't seem like enough information to create the rich, deep auditory world that we experience. How is this mangled pattern of pressure fluctuation created in the first place? Well, the different things in your environment make different sounds. Sounds can differ from each other along a couple of different dimensions. They can be quieter or louder, which means that they make the air particle vibrate less vigorously or more vigorously. This is also called amplitude or magnitude. A high amplitude sound makes the particles vibrate more vigorously, i.e. larger fluctuations in air pressure, so you'll hear a louder sound. And the other dimension along which sounds can differ is frequency. How frequently a particle of air is making one oscillation. In other words, how quickly it's vibrating. How quickly are the waves of air pressure turning over. A faster oscillation is a higher frequency, a slower oscillation is a lower frequency. Very generally, oversimplifying a lot, this correlates to high and low pitched sound. A faster vibration is a higher frequency, and this causes the sensation of high pitch. Of course, there is a third dimension to all this as well, the time dimension. Over time, the amplitude and frequency can change. All of these three dimensions interact with each other. If your particle is already vibrating loudly at a low frequency, and then suddenly a quiet, high frequency pops in, the particle will then be vibrating in two different ways at once. We'd say that it had a high amplitude at a low frequency, and a low amplitude at a high frequency. You could show this particle's vibration using a wavy line that just represents air pressure over time, but it shows you a little more information if you have a three-dimensional graph. Time is represented along the x-axis, frequency along the y-axis, and amplitude along the light-dark axis. Where the graph is darker, there's a higher amplitude. In this graph, it's much easier to see that these are two different sounds coming from different objects. This is more in line with the world behind the sound, with lots of different objects in it. And it's also more in line with our experience of hearing. We intuitively feel that there are lots of different things in our environment making noises, and we can identify what they are. The real world of sound is a lot more complicated than this. The human voice has lots of frequencies where the amplitude peaks. Other natural sounds, like bird song, are the same with a complicated pattern of component frequencies. In a way, this is useful because the sounds are very different to each other. This will help us distinguish human voices from bird song and different speech sounds from each other in the same human voice. But it also means that the real sound pressure fluctuations in a natural scene are mind-blowingly complicated and all mangled together into a two-dimensional pattern of vibration represented with this wavy line. The human brain has to take this wavy line and reconstruct the world from it. It has no hope of doing that successfully unless it can unpack this line into its amplitude and frequency components, where the patterns then become a bit more obvious. Mathematicians often have to unpack data in a similar way, taking a wavy line plotted over the x and y axis and turning it into what's called a spectrogram, showing how the data looks when broken down into different frequencies. They do this using a mathematical process called a Fourier transform, which I can't fully wrap my head around, but a more popular YouTube channel does have a good breakdown of it. Is the brain somehow doing this complicated mathematical transform on the data constantly as it comes in to unpack it and make it more interpretable? The human body actually has a clever workaround to this, and it's not even done within the brain. The sound pressure waves are funneled into the ear along a pathway which I won't describe in too much detail, and they get to the cochlea, a snail-shaped organ. This is where the sound pressure waves get converted into the electrical signals that the brain works with. This happens through a membrane that runs the length of the cochlea, called the basilar membrane, which is thicker at one end and gets thinner as it goes further along. This means that different parts of the membrane resonate at different frequencies. If you play a higher pitched tone and then a lower pitched tone, they will cause different parts of the basilar membrane to vibrate, because different parts of the membrane resonate at different frequencies. If you play the two tones together, in the outside world they'll combine together in the sound pressure in the air, but the basilar membrane will pull them apart again because different parts, as I say, resonate at different frequencies. With a complex natural sound, the same is true. It will pull apart the sound into its component frequencies. This randomly selected part of the membrane will vibrate only if a frequency of roughly 1000 Hz is present in the air, and it will vibrate more vigorously if that frequency has a high amplitude. A bunch of neurons, nerve cells, are connected to the basilar membrane via things called hair cells, and as the membrane vibrates, it generates electrical voltage, which causes the neurons to fire. It's important to note that the neurons themselves aren't physically tuned to different frequencies. They're all basically the same as each other, but they're each attached to different parts of the basilar membrane, which are tuned to different frequencies. So in the neurons straight on the other side of the basilar membrane, you have basically the same information as I have here in my spectrogram. The information is encoded, which means that the properties of the real sound have been transduced into something that the brain can work with. At this point, the frequency is encoded by which neuron is firing, because different ones fire at different frequencies. The amplitude is encoded by how fast the neuron is firing, its firing rate per second, and changes over time are just preserved as changes over time. The brain's response changes over time just as the actual sound does. This big bundle of neurons is called the cochlear nerve, and at this point it encodes the sound very faithfully. It hasn't processed it at all yet. If you measured what the nerve is doing, it would directly correlate to the actual sound outside your ear. So before we go any further, how can nerves and neurons process information at all? A nerve is just a big bundle of neurons that are travelling in the same direction. A neuron is a specialised type of cell. It has a soma, this is the cell body that contains all the things you learnt about in biology, the nucleus and so on, and it has several dendrites, which are branches that carry electrical signals into the soma, and it has one axon, a branch that transmits an electrical signal out of the soma, which often splits into different branches some way away from the soma. So the impulses come in through the dendrites and out along the axon. The soma acts as a kind of filter. It has a threshold voltage that it has to get to before it will fire an impulse down the axon. This threshold is called a spike threshold. This means that if the odd impulse comes in from one dendrite or another, it won't meet the spike threshold and it won't get passed on. However, if lots of impulses come in along a few dendrites, the threshold will be reached and it will fire down the axon. The axons of one cell connect to the dendrites of another, and this connection point is called a synapse. A synapse can be excitatory or inhibitory. If a lot of impulses from cell A are going into an excitatory synapse with cell B, that will make cell B more likely to reach its threshold and fire. However, if the synapse is inhibitory, then impulses from cell A will make cell B less likely to fire. These are the basic principles that allow neurons to connect together into circuits and process information. We understand how neural circuits work fairly well because we've done lots of quite invasive studies of animals' brains, But we don't know as well how human speech processing works, because those studies are too invasive to ethically do on humans, and no other animals seem to be able to process speech the way we do. To explain how neural circuits work, I'm going to give you an example of how the brain might do a bit of speech processing based on how neural circuits tend to work. This isn't necessarily how the human brain is doing it, and it's very oversimplified, but it's just to give you an idea of the kind of thing the brain does to process information. Let's say that you have a neural circuit for recognizing the syllable cat. That syllable is a specific pattern of information along the time, frequency, and amplitude axes. Here it is on a spectrogram, and as we know, that's the information the brain has, thanks to the basilar membrane. Let's start with a simple layer of neurons that are responsive to different frequencies, just like the ones in the cochlear nerve. As the word cat is heard, a specific pattern of activity plays out in this layer. Now, another layer of neurons that are more specialized. One over here is connected to all the neurons that fire when the ears hear the start of a k sound. If you say p, there's some overlap, but it's not enough to reach the spike threshold of this specialized neuron. That threshold is only reached when the ear clearly hears k, because of the special array of connections this neuron has. In other words, this neuron filters out anything that isn't k. We say that it's sensitive to k. Another neuron in this layer has a different sequence of connections to the first layer. This one only gathers up enough voltage to fire if the ear hears ah. I think you can probably see where this is going. This layer is made up of specialized neurons that respond to tiny disjointed bits of speech. The next layer's neurons are sensitive to longer chunks. One might be sensitive to ka and one to at. And the final layer's neuron is sensitive to the entire syllable, cat. There'll be other neurons sensitive to different patterns of sound. Again, very important to note that this isn't a real-world example, just a hypothetical to show you the kind of processing that a neural circuit might do. So what do we actually know about human speech processing? We usually can't get down to the level of individual neurons in their circuits because that requires very invasive techniques. We can use things like fMRI, which measure which broad areas of the brain are active at a given time. Techniques like this are very low resolution, both in space and time. fMRI is actually measuring a blood flow response the brain has a few seconds after an area has been active, so it can't show you what's happening millisecond by millisecond. But it gives us some idea of what the brain is doing. From each ear, the cochlear nerve runs to the cochlear nucleus and splits into a couple of branches. Within each cochlear nucleus, the information is processed in a huge array of ways, with some neurons preserving the original information very faithfully, and some neurons amplifying some aspects of the data and crushing down others. This is all very basic data processing, probably just to optimize the raw data for whatever has to happen to it next, to get the most out of it. Out of the cochlear nucleus, there are nerve fibers leading to the superior olivary complex on the same side of the brain, and also fibers crossing over to the same part on the opposite side of the brain. This is the first major point where information from the left and right ear meet each other, and its main function seems to be to analyze the auditory scene and work out where different sounds are coming from. The superior olivary complex projects fibers to the lateral lemniscus, which also gets fibers direct from the cochlear nucleus. And then eventually the information ends up in the inferior colliculi. This seems to finish the job of localizing different sound sources within a natural scene. The information eventually gets to the cortex. This is the thin outer few layers of the brain that do most of the really high-level processing. Specifically, it reaches the left and right auditory cortex, and these are located on the sides of the brain, kind of near the ears. The left auditory cortex seems to be particularly important for speech perception, aided by the fact that it's very sensitive to changes in sound over time, and natural speech contains very rapid changes in sound over time. Historically, researchers based a lot of their judgments on how brain damage caused different types of speech disability. If a certain part of the brain is damaged, for example because the person has a stroke, they may be able to speak fluently, but the speech will be complete nonsense. If another part is broken, they might be able to speak something that makes sense, but in a very broken and disjointed way. Through these studies, an early model was established that said speech is understood in a place called Wernicke's area and produced in a place called Broca's area. Researchers still sometimes talk about these areas, but as neuroimaging improves, it's becoming clear that this model is a bit oversimplistic and the areas aren't all that well defined to begin with. Here there are two broad areas of research that sometimes struggle to reconcile with each other: how the brain is physically structured and how it does things from a computational angle. Computationally, speech processing seems to be hierarchical. The brain combines small units like syllables to form bigger and bigger structures like phrases and sentences. You can break speech into syllables even if you don't understand the language you're listening to, because they're usually characterized by a louder nucleus in the middle and quieter bits either side where the consonants are. Research by David Popel's lab shows that the brain does actually do this when listening to foreign speech, locking onto the rhythm of syllables, because you can tell what they are from the raw acoustic data without knowing anything about what they mean. But what does it mean for the brain to lock onto the rhythm of syllables? This is something called neural entrainment, where if you're sensing something happening that seems to be repetitive and happens at a certain rate, in order to use its resources most efficiently, part of the brain will work out how frequently the thing is happening and anticipate it happening at that rate, so that it can allocate its resources most efficiently and at the right time to process it. I'm not an expert in entrainment, so by all means correct me if you think I've explained that badly. As I say, the brain can probably just do this on the fly, because you can tell where the syllables are just by looking at the acoustic data. I dare say most of us can't read spectrograms of people speaking, but you can still see where the syllables are. But Popel's research shows that the brain isn't just entraining to syllables, it's also entraining to higher structures, specifically to phrases and sentences. By phrase, I think he means the grammatical concept of a phrase, a part of a sentence that serves a certain function, like a noun phrase, the red dog, or a verb phrase, went to the shop. In his experiments, he keeps things simple by using words that are 1 syllable long, phrases that are 2 syllables long, and sentences that are 4 syllables long. Red dogs drink wine. If you play lots of these sentences one after the other, the brain synchronizes at 3 levels. The syllabic level, about 4 Hz, the phrasal level, about 2 Hz, and the sentential level, about 1 Hz. Remember that Hertz is cycles per second, so 4 Hz is faster than 1 Hz. In a talk that's on YouTube, Popel makes the good point that while the syllable information is reconstructible from the acoustic signal, the words, phrases, and sentences aren't. A sentence can be 3 syllables long or 15 syllables long, and there's nothing in the acoustic signal reliably telling you where the sentences start and end. Yes, the person will start and stop speaking at certain points, but in natural speech, all too often those breaks can happen mid-sentence, or a person can glide between sentences without stopping, so there's no way for the brain to tell where the phrases and sentences are without first doing extra processing to understand some of the meaning of the speech, because once you've understood the meaning, it then becomes clear where the sentences are. So clearly the brain is entraining at several levels of processing. Interestingly, 2 levels seem to be missing: the phoneme, the individual speech sound, and the word. This makes sense to me. Phonemes are a lot less consistent in what they look like on a spectrogram. They vary a huge amount, whereas syllables are a lot more consistent in their acoustic pattern, and as Popel points out in his talk, the length of time that a syllable lasts is pretty consistent between languages. There's a specific limited catalogue of syllables that can exist in any given language. In English, that's in the thousands, easy enough for the brain to store thousands of syllable templates, especially given that it's capable of recognizing thousands and thousands of different objects and people. In this video, I've kind of built it up from sound to the ear to the cortex. In another video on this topic, I'm going to address some higher level questions. What is a word from the brain's perspective? How does the brain make the leap from simple things that it can have templates of, like syllables, to abstract things that it can't possibly have templates of, like random sentences you've never heard before? In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.